Hi, I'm Gavin,
I'm Ryan.
and welcome back to the S.O.U.N.D Project.
All right, so for this episode, we're going to talk about things that we can run into in office spaces acoustically.
Yeah.
Office spaces kind of have their own set of things that we can run into, just like with them being smaller spaces. And then oftentimes you'll walk in and there's not usually treatment in there. And then they also can have like all glass surfaces and things like that.
Sure.
So we're going to go through that today. So firstly, there have been some conference rooms and things in like offices that we've done that have been like all glass. Like there's often it's not completely sealed off. Like there's gaps and things like that. So how do we accomplish like putting treatment in there, but still keeping a very clean and modern aesthetic?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing with office environments is that we have to usually handle two different things. A lot of the requests are sound isolation issues, that we have that where sound is bleeding from one area to the next. And sometimes it can be an annoyance to people, but other times in office spaces, it's a privacy issue as well. Right. Like sensitive information is being discussed, like someone's, having a very difficult conversation with their boss, and then they don't want everyone out in the office space to hear. And any sensitive information that's talked about, it needs to be contained. So the isolation piece is important, but then there's also the sound quality, because there's so many studies that are done in office spaces where productivity suffers when there's a bad acoustical environment. Yeah. And it's even something where we do a AIA presentation on LEED certification, and one of the things that is a category is acoustics, because acoustics is one of the number one things that people complain about in LEED certified buildings. And it's just something that you want to make that work environment as productive and peaceful as possible. And so we get called in from time to time to do that.
Sure. One of the big things that kind of impacts the isolation is there's a lot of times where if there's a drop tile ceiling involved, that sometimes the walls don't go all the way up to the deck, just because office spaces, especially commercial type ones, tend to be like rented out. So what's a solution for if the wall doesn't go all the way up to the deck for the isolation?
Yeah, that's the tough thing I'd say most of the offices are built that way. I know the office we're in right now, it's built that way. You can pop your head above the ceiling tile and just look right over the wall into what's next. And the tough thing is that sound will just go up and over. Drop tiles are great for a visual barrier. Sure. They're not great for stopping sound. Inherently, we always use the water analogy. Imagine filling up a room with water. Where the water would leak out is where sound would leak out. Well, drop tile ceiling grids have so many gaps, and those ceiling tiles are not perfectly sealed to the metal grid, and so sound will go up and over. Now, ways that you can combat that without significant construction would be to, one, backfill above the ceiling tiles with heavy insulation. Now, sometimes you get in trouble with that because if the grid isn't rated to hold that amount of weight, sometimes it could collapse or just be an unsafe environment. So you want to put enough thickness up there to be effective, but you also don't want to create an unsafe situation. So insulation above there is something that can help. Now, I will say that sometimes I've gone into spaces where they think that they're helping with the sound isolation by just putting maybe a 1 or 2 foot perimeter around the room of insulation, but the center is completely open. That doesn't work. It's something where the sound would just take up through the center and then scoop over. And so it's better to fill the entire ceiling. The other thing you can do with drop tile ceilings is there's ceiling tiles called high CAC tiles, which is ceiling attenuation class. And the higher the number, it's similar to STC, the sound transmission class, but the higher the CAC number, the more sound they will block. And those are just have typically more mass, and it's going to a lot of times seal a little bit better to the grid, and you can help that way. But it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to do a ton of work to the walls if you don't address the ceiling in some way, because it'll just go up and over. Right. The other unfortunate thing about office spaces and drop tile ceilings is that they're usually done that way so that they can share a plenum up above the offices, and that's the return air path is above the offices. And if you take the walls up to the deck, suddenly that is cut off, and it completely changes what the HVAC consultant designed. So you have to then add in ductwork, and it just becomes very expensive.
That makes sense. And that's something too that when you're talking about using isolation or insulation rather to better isolate that, I feel like a common thing that gets confused sometimes is that the putting treatment panels up will not help the isolation case.
Yeah, and that's a common misconception, but I can see why. I mean, you think of acoustical panels and you think that would stop the amount of sound that's bouncing around the room, so therefore less sound is going to leak out. But you could cover a room 100% with acoustical panels and it wouldn't change how much leaks in and out. It's more of a mass issue, density of materials, airspace. And one of the biggest things is just the gaps that you typically see in office spaces. Like one of the biggest ones is you shut any office door and a lot of times there's an inch air gap underneath the door itself, and you can just hear voices skip underneath that, and a gap like that will let at least 90% of the sound out, you know, and so everything has to be sealed. But again, you got to be careful with that because sometimes the return air is actually going underneath the door, and you seal that up and you cause other problems. So the other thing that happens a lot of times in office environments is where typically, like in this office that we have here, you have multiple windows next to each other. And my office that is sitting back here, we designed it so that it was the right dimensions to finish at one of those seams. Because if you did it in between the seams, there's no way to seal that against the window itself. There'd just be an air gap and sound can just go right around it. So it's always like trying to think through those details and make sure you're putting a good plan together.
Yeah, that makes sense. So with that, so like when you're dealing with glass or like oftentimes conference rooms are going to have whiteboards and things like that. How do you take that into consideration?
Yeah, with office spaces is a little different than, well, it's a lot different than the studios that we design. It's just where we have a lot more control over the acoustics. There's, things like glass, like you said, whiteboards, other reflective surfaces. A big conference room table is a big reflective surface too. And a lot of times we're just grabbing what we can as far as like surfaces that we could treat. The ceiling is a great one. I mean, if it's drywalled, then you can add acoustical panels to it. If it's drop tile, there's actually high NRC panels as well that absorb energy better. So not blocking it like the CAC, but NRC tiles will absorb sound energy better. And I would say that any other surface available that we could put acoustical panels and it would still look nice and perform well, you kind of do what you can in those spaces. Like, would it be ideal to cover the windows with thick curtains? Absolutely, but a lot of times people want that natural light in there. Of course, like we've done it in cases where they're having a very important call and they want to draw a curtain, and it's like, hey, the audio quality needs to be there because there's just so much video conferencing that's happening these days. And I will also say that all of these things. We've been talking kind of in corporate environments, but home offices have this same struggle. It's like on the isolation front, you might be at home with your kids and it needs to be isolated for when you're on a video call. And so you have to go through considerations on that front, or you want the audio quality not to suffer when you're at home and make it sound unprofessional. So we work in both areas.
Sure. And that's something that more so on the commercial side, but especially with like Zoom and Teams videos or Teams video calls being a bigger thing now, people worry about like the aesthetic as well. And that's something that even if you're doing off the shelf treatment, like you can still get like, color schemes that match the company colors, or like you can get them printed onto and things like this. So there are options to make it look really, really good to where maybe it's just like an art background or something opposed to just like these gray panels behind you. Yeah,
I mean, I did the same thing in my office. Like I actually face my windows, so acoustically that's not the best environment, but that's what I wanted for sunlight and everything to be able to come in and feel good in that space. But then the back wall of my office is all these hexagon panels from Acoustical Fulfillment, and it's different depths so it gives a little bit of interest when it comes to visual depth as well. And I think it matters because I do get compliments a lot about what the back wall of my office looks like, but it's also helping me acoustically.
Yeah, for sure. And when we're talking about isolation as well, like door sweeps and things like that, there are some fairly simple and inexpensive solutions to take care of that. So do you want to talk about some of those?
Sure, yeah. When the thing comes with the doors, having a seal around the entire perimeter is really great. And I mentioned the gap at the bottom, and that is usually the worst offender of all of them. And with those, you can get these automatic door bottoms. Like we recommend a lot from like isostore.com. Like they have some really good ones where it has a plunger on the edge, and when you shut the door, it drops down a seal to seal to the ground. And those are great to make sure there's no tripping hazards going in between offices. It just seals down to the floor. And then around the perimeter, like have gasketing like you would treat an exterior door, and making sure it's as airtight as possible. The door itself, like typically doors in offices are at least thick enough to block sound adequately enough. Like you usually don't have to go with a really heavy studio isolation door or anything like that. However, they have to be sealed to have any chance of being isolated.
Sure. Okay, so some offices are going to have like hard floor, and then some are going to have, carpeting. So does anything need to change based on like what the flooring is or anything like that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, some office spaces that have a hard floor, it's almost imperative that the ceiling is treated in some way. I remember working on a bank project, actually. It's like 5-story building in Fishers, and it was going to be a concrete floor and a concrete ceiling, and then a lot of glass otherwise. And I just had to work with the architect and the client and say, we absolutely need to do something on one of these surfaces. It's either the floor or the ceiling. We need to either carpet the floor or do some sort of hanging clouds. And the aesthetic, they wanted to be kind of industrial, but at the same time, if they had built it the way they originally designed it, it wouldn't be functional at all. And that's one thing I do want to point out when it comes to office environments, is that the acoustical environment you're in, sometimes it can be taxing for you, just how tired you get throughout the day, and your focus levels is like if you're constantly processing noise from adjacent cubicles or HVAC noise or anything like that, it can affect your day, you know, and by the end of the day, you can be really tired because your brain's just constantly processing this noise. And so that's, one of the big things that we like to treat these spaces is, effective communication is always a good thing, and making sure that the video calls are heard well on the other end. But there's a lot of time where you're not on those calls, but you're still working, and you're still dealing with the acoustical environment you have.
There's some that some offices that we've worked in that they've talked about doing like the active noise generators and like to create that white noise. So do you want to talk about like what those do and what those offer, and then like when we would recommend those versus just normal treatment?
Yeah, a lot of times it's a bit of a last-ditch effort for me to suggest them, only because of that piece I just mentioned about it being taxing to work in an environment that's loud. If you have white noise going on all the time, your brain is processing that. And so I usually like to fix it with construction techniques, acoustical panels, but sometimes it's just not possible. Like I mentioned, the shared plenum, we're not taking the walls to the deck. What can we do to get some privacy? That's where some of those white noise and active noise cancellation units will do a good job. And the thing is a lot of times they're not blocking any sound, they're just masking it, know? And so it's something where you might hear voices coming through the wall, but you won't be able to understand what it's being said. So like I said, it's something that's just a necessity every once in a while that we recommend that. But if we can avoid it and handle it another way, and to be honest, there is the budget component into this. If we work with large corporations a lot of times where they'll have 80 conference rooms in this huge campus of a facility, and to do that amount of construction to improve all of the spaces, maybe that's just not in the cards budget-wise. It would be a lot of not only budget, but then the time that these rooms would be down, they'd lose so much productivity out of that. And so you just have to weigh out your options. Like we're not tied to one thing or the other. We just want to look for what's best for the client.
For sure. And then I want to also just briefly talk about kind of our process with offices, just because generally, like with our proposals, it's by room. So it's like if we're doing a studio, it's like, okay, how many rooms do you have? And that's what determines how much it would be. But for offices, it's more so determined on, okay, how many rooms are there, but then how many of them are the same dimension. And so just like if there is a group that is an like commercial office or even at home offices, or like we've done rented office buildings as well, that it's just like that is something to consider, where it's like, hey, if most of them are the same space, then we really do treat it as one room.
I've gone on site and done testing at some of those types of facilities, and it's like I know I only need to test 4 types of rooms, and they're all within an inch of each other. As far as dimensions go, then I know that it's going to translate to each space. So we do a plan for just one of those types of rooms and say to extrapolate that over all of them.
Sure. Okay, so all that being said, do you want to go ahead and do a quick summary of just some of the tips and techniques that we've talked about in this episode?
Yeah, I think the key is if you determine that isolation is necessary for your space, try to look for weak links and hit those kind of low-hanging fruit of things that you can do that are very easy, like adding sweeps to a door or putting seals around the door. That's an easy thing, doesn't cost a lot of money, and there's no downtime for the room. Just do those things. Adding insulation above a drop tile, that's not hard to do either. So look for those easy things that you can do, and then if more complex things need to happen, then that's something that we can help out with. On the sound quality side of things, it's grabbing opportunities to treat the room on spaces that are free. It's like you probably have some windows in there. You probably have a big screen, other things that are blocking it, acoustical panels in between there. And like you said, you can put logos on it. You can do all sorts of things. So I think just taking advantage of the opportunities that you have to making the space sound better. Again, these aren't recording studios. They don't have to be acoustically perfect. But they do need to be improved because some of them can be very difficult to understand speech in. So
For sure.
yeah, I think it's important to make sure you have a space that you feel like you can be productive and creative in, and we want to help you with that. So that's been another episode of the Sound Project. If you've got any acoustical issues in your office space that you work in and you'd like some help with that, please comment below, and we'll see you next week.